I thought actually I'd give you a bit of an introduction who we are, why we came together, from where we come from, and why we also think that Copenhagen Atomics and PSI are a good match, right? So, and I just give you some background who we are, and then you will see maybe why we want to go this route. So when you looked into the newspapers or earlier this year, 1st of July, we first announced our collaboration, 1st of July on our webpage. Of course, been a long time in the making. Did not happen overnight, but quite a bit of negotiation. And then it happened very quick that it echoed in our press releases, were nuclear news the same day, news flies fast. Then in the Danish newspapers a couple of days later, Swiss newspapers 2 weeks later, everything takes a bit longer in Switzerland, it seems, even the news. But it's been visible. So I think it was for me an interesting time because I must say I have given more interviews in the last 3 months than I gave in the 10 years before. So it's a good sign, right? In Switzerland, usually we don't talk much about nuclear. But I talk about PSI first, and then I talk about nuclear. So PSI is, simple answer to the question, is we are the largest research center in Switzerland for natural and engineering sciences, like a big national lab in the US or the famous nuclear research centers in Germany and France. We are part of the federal domain, the ETH domain, which means we are partnering up with the 2 large schools. I mean, you know, ETH Zurich, EPFL, both very well-reputed schools in Europe, always in the top 5 in Europe, top 20 worldwide. So, and that is, of course, our strong collaboration partner. I myself, I'm a professor in Lausanne, so we always have the university links. That puts us in a very powerful position, this setup. When you look at the numbers, PSI, as of now, has around 2,200 employees. 65 of them are professors affiliated with universities for that link. And you see we have a very strong backbone on technicians and engineers, and that's important because we are running large facilities. And I think this is what these guys need. You will need many technicians for whatever is going to come in the future, and I think this is a nice match. We have decades of experience with large facilities of different kinds. So as of all these research centers, they have become kind of multi-mission labs. When you look to CERN, it's probably the one exception. CERN is basically dedicated to finding the origins of our universe, so to say, of our matter. But a typical research center like PSI or also like the American labs usually evolves around several missions. And there's, of course, still a big part on fundamental research. But of course, we also have future technologies, quantum computing, AI, you name it. I'm not going to speak much about that. Health innovation. So we have radiopharmacy, we have proton therapy. So that's nuclear science in a wider sense. And of course, then we have energy and climate. And we have those nice windmills and solar panels there on that picture. As a matter of fact, half of our energy research is nuclear. And in Switzerland, it's the only place where we do nuclear energy research. That puts us also into a nice position. There is no competition for us in Switzerland. PSI has a unique selling point there, which is nice. I don't have to fight with others over nuclear money. So there is not much. There is not much, but there is. So now this is PSI on a nice summer day. Not always like this. And one of the defining features is, of course, these 4 facilities. And if you speak in a very, well, I guess, yeah, these are just big microscopes. The closer you want to look, the bigger the microscope gets. And our longest microscope is 800 meters long. That's here in the forest. It's a long accelerator that emits coherent X-rays, laser radiation. It's an X-ray laser with which we looked deep into matter. And then we have other light sources. And the nice thing is PSI is, to my knowledge, the only place worldwide where we have all kinds of radiation. We have synchrotron radiation, so photons. We have neutrons. We have a quite powerful neutron source, comparable flux-wise to a research reactor. We have a muon source, quite special, and we have our X-ray laser here. And these are really unique tools, and the combination is worldwide unique. Nobody else has that, to my knowledge. And what we do with it is, of course, we are looking into everything from the macro scale. Neutrons are wonderful when you want to look into something that X-rays cannot penetrate. Right? You can basically monitor a car engine working because neutrons can shine through it and image that, what's happening inside. On the other length scale, we have nanometer scale. And there, of course, we are talking about molecular biology and so on. But also here, structures on semiconductors. And just to have a few nice pictures, of course, I have to do that, right? This on the left-hand side is an Intel chip on a resolution of sub-nanometer here. And you really can see these single conducting lines inside the microchip. So if you look for a Trojan that some company has put into there, you may find it. That's the hint, that's the background. On the other side, you actually see a mouse brain as part of the Human Brain Project. And you see we are going here really into the far, far sub-nanometer scale. Quite impressive, I must say. Now we are going back in history, 60 years back. Looked a bit different then, and so this is PSI in 1960, and and of course this is where we come from. PSI was the nuclear research center of Switzerland. Of course it has evolved, and today it's only part of it, but back then PSI had the very first Swiss reactor, 1957, pool-type reactor, a nice Cherenkov glowing inside, in that building here in red. Then we built a prototype, 20, later on 30 megawatt thermal, so that's a third of what Copenhagen Atomics wants to build. I found a picture of the construction site I should have put inside. It's a huge construction site. So it's quite impressive to see how these guys put it into a container while we had looked like a big power plant. It's a big hall, you can see that. We have the hot laboratory. That's the laboratory in which we handle radioactive material, very, very important. It's the oldest. That's not there here, but it opened in 1963. And our hot laboratory head is also here. So if you want to talk to Marco later, he will be happily talking to you. It is the oldest operating Swiss facility, right? It's still operating after more than 60 years. And I had an interesting anecdote that I learned very recently. The first radioactive material we got into there was fuel irradiated in Denmark. And the research reactor in 1964, the first fuel that we ever got, so our collaboration with Denmark goes very, very far back. I just learned that a few days ago. So it's quite interesting. I did not know that. And then we had a third reactor, so a small research reactor, so we had 3 reactors on site, so nobody can say we have no experience. Downside to this, they're all shut down, right? So the last one was shut down in 2011. As I said, we have still our facilities, and despite that we have moved into more photons, into more muon research, we still have a bunch of nuclear science on site. I mean, we have the research reactors that are shut down. We have radioisotope production, that's of course nuclear related. Proton therapy is radiation, nothing else. So of course the methods and understanding is exactly the same as for nuclear power. We have the hot laboratory as mentioned. We have a large test facility for small modular reactors, radiopharmacy. And here, this structure does not belong to us, but people may know what that is. It's the large intermediate storage for Swiss nuclear waste. That's for the power plants. That's where the spent fuel goes to, and that is where also the decommissioning waste of the power plants goes to. We instead have also a little facility here, and that is basically for all waste that does not come from power plants, but from elsewhere. Medical, industrial, as a matter of fact, mostly from PSI, because we are the biggest waste producers outside the power plants. But waste conditioning, understanding how you condition waste for storage is also part of our DNA. It's important. You want to minimize waste, but you need to also to know how to handle nuclear waste. And that's something where we are very good at. And I think, again, that's something where we match because this is knowledge that we have in abundance. And then, of course, our neutron sources. This is a powerful machine that produces as many neutrons as our former research reactors did. So it's a nice tool that we use for our investigations too. Looking a bit at Switzerland, I'll do that very quick. Again, that's where we come from, right? I mean, of course, we have not been dealing with modern plants lately, but we are dealing with what we have. You know, Switzerland has a ban on new nuclear plants for now. That may change, who knows? It has no ban on research reactors, so whatever we are planning is completely legally covered, so no worries. There will be no problem there. But we have our reactors in Switzerland, two very old ones here from 69 and 71. Some of the oldest, people say the most mature ones, that's what the owners say. They are some of the oldest that are operating. But we have also more advanced reactors, Gösgen and Leibstadt, that are large plants, 1,200 megawatts, at the scale that you showed earlier, at the scale of that factory hall, right? So that would be Leibstadt, for example. If you go to 60 years of operation, then the last one of this is going to be decommissioned only in 2044. So we still have a good 20 years ahead of us, so that's important. And if I read the newspapers these days, I have a feeling they will all operate to 80 years. Who knows? It's quite likely, I must say. Then we take our fuel that goes here into these large containers. And again, you may say that's a waste, or that is waste, but it's also a waste to dispose them after all. But we will likely. So whether we will dig them out in 100 years, I don't know. I'm not going to speculate. You will also not be held responsible for that statement in 100 years. So it's fine. But anyways, what we plan, and Switzerland is quite advanced at that, is we plan to get that into our final waste disposal. And we have a site identified, not licensed, but identified by the waste management organization that said that the place here, it's not so far from here. This would have been my guess, because that's very close to PSI. But somehow it turned out differently. Now it goes into the canton of Zurich. And the Waste Management Association, NAGRA, will file its license request. And then in a few years, we will know whether it will be granted. And then we have a licensed site, and we can start designing and building our waste disposal. Likely not going to happen before, I don't think anything will go in there before 2050, but the construction will, of course, take time. But that's the situation in Switzerland. I thought this is important also to understand where we stand now, how we match. Because, of course, that means we are operating our power plants for decades more, for possibly 2, maybe even 4 decades. And these power plants don't get necessarily better. Let's put it that way, right? There's material aging. Of course, you can backfit a lot, so you can replace almost everything, but not really everything. So our nuclear authority, and you have not spoken much about licensing, but licensing is, of course, a huge deal, right? I mean, licensing nuclear power plants is a bitch, you could say, to put it very bluntly, right? I mean, many of these processes actually have been delayed, and we want to do it better, right? We want to understand how licensing works. We work very, very closely together with our nuclear authority. So we are working with ENSI. ENSI is our nuclear regulator in the country. And we have decades of experience working with them in the oversight of the power plants. That's the one side of the medal. And we also have decades of experience working against them, because we have nuclear facilities ourselves. It puts us into a strange position that on the one hand we support them, on the other hand we are on the oversight side, so they are overseeing us. We separate that very, very carefully. It's two very different things, no conflict of interest there. But of course, when we look at spent nuclear fuel, which we do for the utilities, for the power plants, of course, we do that in our hot laboratory, and that's a nuclear facility. That is under the oversight of our nuclear regulator. So interesting position, but that means we know both sides, and that puts us into a very good position to I don't think that many people in Switzerland understand licensing of nuclear better than we do. And it's not always easy. So that much we have to say. I have to say ENSI is known as a strict regulator. ENSI is also known as a very fair regulator and as a very technically well-versed regulator. And that's good, because you can argue with them on a technological basis, not just on a formal basis. And that's important. And so I think for us, it is also an interesting exercise because we haven't licensed a reactor in the last decades. For ENSI, it's an important exercise. For you, it is an important exercise, for us as well. And if you manage to demonstrate you can license a reactor with a Swiss regulator, I think, I wouldn't say you have a free pass with other regulators, but at least in Europe, you stand a very good chance to get it passed with other regulators too. ENSI is very well networked with all other regulators in Europe. And I think if this works, it's a landmark in licensing. Education also important, right? I mean, of course, for us, this project is so super interesting because it's, of course, attractive. We are doing something new, right? We are not working on our old clunkers, but we are actually working with new technology. And of course, our young people are super excited about the perspectives of working here. Okay, so before we are part of this Generation 4 club, that is a membership that we have, not particularly active, but what we have established lately, of course, is that we have become more a contact point also for other partners. For example, here we are now, when it comes to Generation 3 reactors, we are working together with EDF, with Hitachi and Westinghouse, so we have also industrial experience. 50% of our budget comes from industry. So we also have the industry contacts, much more than any other place at PSI. I think that's also a strength. We are used to an industrial context much more than a normal division of a research laboratory. Just as an interesting point, we are also looking at radionuclides. I mean, I don't know whether, of course, you could produce radionuclides, you will be producing radionuclides somehow. Whether that's an interesting business case is something to be looked at, but in principle, you could extract relevant nuclides from the salt. Who knows? It's perhaps a nice side business, maybe not at your center of your business right now, but of course it could be looked at. When we look at our facilities, and I'm not going to talk too much about it, I just want to mention two facilities, our hot laboratory very briefly, and also the large neutron source. And our hot laboratory, as I said, is our oldest nuclear facility in Switzerland and is one of the very, very few laboratories in Europe, maybe a handful that we still have, where you really can work with highly radioactive material and where you can work with spent fuel from the power plants. So we get nuclear fuel rods from our Swiss power plants and investigate them. For routine reasons, that is just done on a standard basis. If something goes wrong with a fuel rod, doesn't happen often, fortunately, but it happens. And then these fuel rods come to us and we investigate what went wrong. And who else can do that? It's, as I said, a handful of places in Europe that can do that. We are also looking at Generation 4 reactors, and what we do is basically, and I think that's a nice sequence here, we get these fuel rods from our power plants, and the yellow color is on purpose. That's the view through a 70 centimeter thick lead shield glass, because otherwise you wouldn't look at it. So that shields the radiation. And here you actually see the fuel rods coming in. And then we basically inspect them, and then we start cutting them down. We chop them in pieces, and we take smaller and smaller samples. And eventually our samples actually get on the micrometer size. We can cut samples from fuel that are micrometers big. Why are we doing this? Because the smaller they get, the less radioactivity you have. And eventually the radioactivity of these samples gets so low that we can take them to our big microscopes and really investigate the structural details. And again, this chain coming from highly radioactive material that goes into the hot lab, cutting samples down so small that you can really take them in your pocket and walk away with them. Not quite, but almost, right? It's basically then taking them here to our microscopes for neutron imaging or for synchrotron light imaging, and then you really understand the structural details and you get really the full story, what went wrong with your fuels. Right, another nice thing that we have is this, our friendly monster here. If you think it is at CERN, it's actually the world's most powerful proton accelerator. It's not at CERN, it's at PSI. So you should know that. I think that's an important message, right? So it is not the highest in particle energy. When you look at the large ring at CERN, of course, the individual particle energy is orders of magnitude higher. But what we have here is we have the highest current. So we have the most particles circling around in their protons. And if you look at it, actually, then it has the amazing beam current of 2.4 milliamps. It's not megaamps, it's milliamps. It's not much. But if it flies in vacuum, it's a lot. And not many people manage that, to really accelerate particles to 600 megaelectron volt and have them circling here in this circle. The power of that beam is 1.44 megawatt. And that is a lot of power. And that power goes onto that small spot here of that size. So just imagine this small area and you put 1.44 megawatt, right? 1440 megawatt, I mean, that's 10 strong car engines, the entire power focused onto one spot. It's quite impressive. What we are doing with this is actually, so we are focusing on this target, and then we are producing spallation. So we are producing neutrons. So the proton beam hits this target here from below, and then interacts here with these spallation materials. We use lead for most part. You can use other materials, tantal and so on. But that generates a wave of neutrons, and these neutrons we use also for imaging, but you can also use them for material investigations. And what we found is basically that if you put samples of materials in here, it could be structural samples from a molten salt reactor or other machines, we can actually irradiate them much faster than you would irradiate them in a power plant. So if you really have to qualify materials for radiation, and the question came earlier, right? So you need to prove that your material is radiation hard. You could do that also in this facility. Yeah, and you get much higher DPA. This is DPA, it means displacement. It means how much radiation these parts have seen. And so we can actually basically simulate radiation aging much quicker than in a nuclear power plant. And that's interesting for new reactors. That's interesting for fusion, because fusion has that problem big time compared to what kind of radiation damage they have. That's for beginners, right? A fusion plant will see enormous radiation damage. That's the real elephant in the room. I do not know how fusion people will solve that material problem, I have to be honest. And that brings me to Copenhagen Atomics, right? So now I guess you can probably got a hunch why we think we are a good match, why this is complementary to each other, because these guys come with a great concept, I think. And I think we complement them with decades of nuclear knowledge, of radiation protection, of licensing specifically, and we think bringing this together is interesting for us. It makes for a good research story for us. And of course, we also took a careful look of what we are doing, right? I mean, we are a federal research institute, so we have limited flexibility on what we are doing. And of course, I want to make sure I'm not running into an adventure that I cannot predict the outcome. So what I liked about Copenhagen Atomics is really, I think these are the success factors that we have seen. Of course, we have visited Copenhagen Atomics. We had a lot of technical discussions already. We see there's a young, motivated team. We see there's a production facility, so it's not just paper, because many of these startups are just paper concepts. Here we really see something happening, and that's impressive, I must say. What we are bringing into it is, of course, I mean, I also like the similarity in the flags, right? So that's, I thought actually I just play that little catch here with the Swiss and Danish flag. So what we have is one of the team members here was the head of the last research reactor we have in Switzerland, Pavel, sitting in the back. So if you want to learn about Swiss research reactors, he is here. We have Marco, who was head of the hot laboratory today, who was also in charge of a licensing project for a nuclear power plant in Switzerland before Fukushima, because we had plans to build, right? Before Fukushima, Switzerland wanted to start replacing their nuclear power plants. And so there's a lot of experience from there. We have, for our hot laboratory, because it's 60 years old, we had to also renew our license. So again, it's about licensing. How do you deal with licensing a 60-year-old facility according to new Swiss regulations? Not trivial. Took us quite a bit of time, but a steep learning curve, very helpful for also this project. The same with the equipment that went in there. Recently, we started a waste processing utility at PSI again. So we keep on licensing and challenging our regulator, and that's also how we learn. We signed our contract on 1st of July, and then we are anticipating, well, as you have seen, the big steel cask with content eventually. Just to say, we were impressed by the hardware, but you have seen all the pictures, so I'm not repeating this. But you see the colleagues have been there and seem to be very happy about what they saw. For me, more important is what we will start with, because we are so careful in Switzerland, right? So nuclear safety is a non-negotiable value in this country. We have a site located on the PSI place, and what we will do is, because we really want to make sure what we are doing, we will even put another shell, a big airplane crash safe shell around this container to really make sure that nothing happens. Nothing will ever happen, but we really want to be super sure, and this will be very, very convincing also to our regulators that even in the worst case of a complete airplane crash on that facility, nothing will ever happen. And that's what we want to ensure. So that is basically a big hall that comes here. Not that big, but it will be bigger than the container for sure. And then eventually, well, the container will come with all its parts, and then we will start, and then it will look like this likely, and then we will start our experimental campaign. I will not speak about this, just gives you a hunch of the licensing process. I'm not even going to touch it because this is complicated. But it gives you an idea how many steps of licensing are involved, and that's maybe for lunch break or maybe not. You decide. That you have seen our timeline. It's ambitious, but I think doable. And we start our topical discussions with the regulator these days. So we are now entering the technical phase where we try to start sorting out the details, how we are going to proceed to have a swift licensing. And if everything goes right, then this will come true. And for me, it's an exciting journey, I must say. And it's new. You know, I've been here now for 13 years, and for a decade, I have only done old power plants. And if this works out, it's quite a nice story for Switzerland, for nuclear research in there, of course, for Copenhagen Atomics. Yeah, so and I think that's all I want to say. So thank you.